palace was awake long before the sun reached the stone. Light crept slowly through the tall windows, pale and ceremonial, catching dust motes that hovered like hell breath above the marble floors. Somewhere deep within the residence, a clock struck the hour, measured, restrained, indifferent to the lives moving beneath it. This was meant to be an ordinary day, the kind of day the palace had perfected over centuries. Routes rehearsed, doors timed, guards positioned not for defense, but for reassurance. A ceremonial day, predictable, controlled, almost dull in its precision. And yet, from the moment Princess Charlotte stepped into the east corridor, something felt misaligned. The camera drifts behind her small figure as she walks, her shoes barely whispering against the polished floor. She is flanked at a respectful distance by her personal security detail, men whose faces were shaped by discipline rather than expression. Their eyes scan reflections instead of people. Their posture speaks before they ever do. Among them is one guard who does not look at the walls. He looks at her, not out of sentiment, not affection, but vigilance, the kind trained into muscle and bone, the kind that survives long after rules fade into habit. His name does not matter yet. What matters is that he has served long enough to recognize silence when it is wrong. The corridor should have echoed. Royal residences are never truly quiet. There is always movement behind the walls, staff, signals, distant doors opening and closing like a living organism. But here, the sound had thinned, as though something had been held back. He noticed it the way only trained men do, not as fear, but as absence. The formation continued. Princess Charlotte paused briefly near a window, distracted by the gardens beyond the glass. Winter had stripped the hedges bare, leaving geometry where softness once lived. She leaned closer, her breath faintly fogging the pain. That was when it happened. Not a sound, not a shout, a movement. The guard's eyes snapped left, just a fraction of a second faster than protocol allowed. A service door at the end of the corridor stood ajar. It had not been on the morning clearance list. He knew that because he had checked it himself. He felt it then, the tightening beneath the ribs, the quiet internal alarm no briefing ever mentioned. Princess Charlotte turned slightly, as if to speak, and the guard moved, his arm extended, not violently, not theatrically, but decisively, cutting across the space in front of her. His body shifted, placing itself between the child and the open corridor ahead. "Stop," he said. The word landed like a dropped object on marble. The entire formation froze. For half a second, nobody reacted. The palace itself seemed unsure how to respond. Commands were not meant to originate from that position. Not in that tone. Not during movement involving a royal child. A senior officer took one step forward. "What are you doing?" he asked, low and sharp. The guard did not answer. His eyes never left the corridor. Princess Charlotte looked up at him then, not startled, not frightened, just confused. Her hand tightened slightly around the strap of her small bag. "Is something wrong?" she asked. The question was quiet, honest. The guard swallowed once. He felt the weight of centuries pressing against his spine. Every rule he had ever memorized was screaming now. Stand down. Resume formation. Do not disrupt the flow. But his instincts, those older than rank, refused to release their grip. "Please step back, Your Royal Highness," he said. The officer's voice hardened. "That is an order. Lower your arm." Still, he did not move. The corridor remained empty. The open door did not change. But something about the air beyond it felt disturbed, like a room recently vacated in haste. This was a line. Every guard knows where it lies. The invisible boundary between obedience and initiative, between protection and insubordination. It is spoken of only in training rooms, framed as a hypothetical, a warning more than a possibility. Do not cross it. And yet, standing there, the guard understood something with devastating clarity. If he was wrong, he would lose everything. If he was right and did nothing, someone far smaller would pay the price. He took one step forward. "Lock the corridor," he said. The command echoed farther than intended. The officer's face drained a color. "You are out of line," he hissed. "Stand down immediately." Behind them, communications crackled to life. Quiet murmurs raced through earpieces. Somewhere, a door slammed shut, too late, too loud. Princess Charlotte's gaze shifted toward the open corridor. Her brow furrowed just slightly. She knew, not in words, not in understanding, but children sense fractures long before adults admit them. She had felt something moments earlier, a discomfort she could not name, a presence that did not belong. She took a small step closer to the guard. He felt it through the floor. And in that instant, he made the choice. He raised his hand, high this time, unmistakable. Halt all movement. The palace reacted as if struck. Boots stopped mid-step. A ceremonial aide dropped a folder, its contents scattering like startled birds. Somewhere above, a balcony guard leaned over the rail, confused, searching for confirmation that never came. Protocol had been broken, not bent, not interpreted, broken. Within minutes, senior security officials were moving fast through intersecting corridors, their pace urgent but controlled. The phrase unauthorized halt traveled quickly, stripped of context, heavy with implication. Princess Charlotte was escorted away, gently, efficiently, while the guard remained where he stood. Alone now, the corridor door was finally sealed. Behind it, nothing was found. No intruder, no device, no obvious threat. On paper, the incident ended there, but paper does not capture instinct, or timing, or the way a child's hand had trembled before anyone noticed. The guard was disarmed without ceremony, his weapon removed as a formality, not suspicion, but it felt like judgment all the same. He offered no resistance. As he was led away, he passed beneath a row of portraits, faces frozen in oil and gold, generations of watchful eyes that had survived scandals far greater than this. He did not look at them. His mind was replaying the moment again and again. The open door, the silence, the look on the child's face just before he moved. Behind him, the palace resumed its rhythm. Schedules adjusted, routes recalculated, explanations prepared. And yet, beneath the surface, something had shifted. Because one guard had crossed a line he was never meant to approach. And somewhere deep within the system, quiet, meticulous, and unseen, a detail had been missed. The guard shoes echoed on polished floors that had once seemed infinite, now narrowing the corridor's line of authority. Every step measured, but each one heavy with the knowledge that he had defied centuries of unbroken protocol. Officers converged from multiple wings, some old enough to have trained under monarchs who were long gone, their faces carved with discipline so rigid it bordered on sculptural. Their eyes met his with disbelief, then calculation. They were not angry yet. They were still measuring how to contain the rupture he had caused. "You will explain yourself," one senior official said, his tone flat but sharp, like the edge of a ceremonial sword. "Every action you took is now under review." The guard nodded, a single gesture that carried more weight than 1,000 words. He did not flinch. He had not hesitated. Not once. And he would not start now. Behind him, faintly, he could hear the soft, hesitant footsteps of Princess Charlotte being led away. Not in fear, not in defiance, but in confusion. Children understand more than adults sometimes allow. And she had understood that he had acted to protect her. Hours passed like minutes. The palace itself seemed to exhale in restrained shock. Meetings convened in silent rooms where doors clicked shut with precise timing. The guard stood in one such room, facing a panel of officials whose uniforms gleamed and whose expressions were carefully neutral, but whose eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. They reviewed his movements, the halt, the open corridor, the absence of threat. On paper, his decision was indefensible. Yet, in reality, every microsecond he had observed suggested he had acted with intent. Calculated, necessary, human. "Your action disrupted a ceremonial procession," one officer said, voice devoid of judgment but heavy with expectation. "It could have incited panic, endangered the princess, compromised the integrity of palace protocol. Explain how this constitutes duty." The guard's gaze did not waver. He did not offer excuses. He began recounting quietly the details that would never appear in official logs. "The corridor was silent," he said. "The door was ajar, unauthorized." The child paused, hesitated. "There was something there, something not right. I acted to prevent harm." A pause. A glance exchanged among the officials. Protocol was unbroken in text, but fragile in practice. The guard had reminded them of a reality they could not codify. Instinct could surpass instruction. Minutes later, he was taken to another chamber, a smaller room with walls lined in dark oak and the faint smell of wax polish. It was designed to impress and intimidate simultaneously. One officer leaned forward, voice quieter this time, as if speaking too loudly might undo centuries of control. "You chose a line," he said, "a line no guard should cross. Did you consider the consequences?" "I did," the guard replied, "and I considered the alternative. I could not allow the child to continue without intervention." Silence filled the room, thick as smoke in a candle-lit hall. The words had weight, but they were insufficient to ease attention. Outside, the palace continued its rhythm, unaware or unwilling, to acknowledge the tremor that had passed through its very foundations. Meanwhile, in a distant wing, Princess Charlotte's caretaker whispered reassurances, though her tone held traces of worry. The child's eyes were large, searching, processing the subtle disruption that adults could not explain. Children noticed the gaps, the hesitation, the fleeting moments when the world wobbles around them. And in that space, she felt the hand of protection, firm and unwavering, though she did not yet understand its cost. Back in the interrogation chamber, the guard remained standing. His mind replayed the corridor endlessly. The light on the marble, the slight tilt of Charlotte's head, the imperceptible tension in the air. Every detail mattered. Every heartbeat mattered. It was why he had acted, and why the consequences could not be escaped. Hours blurred into documentation. Official statements, witness reports, movement logs, and internal memos were compiled. Each one told a version of the incident that leaned toward fault, toward disruption, toward insubordination. But the truth, the pulse beneath the text, was another story entirely. Somewhere in the palace, another official finally noticed an overlooked signal. A maintenance report had indicated the door had been unsealed for routine checks, but the schedule had never been logged. A tiny administrative error, a detail lost in the machinery of centuries, had created the conditions for what now appeared as defiance. The realization did not reach the guard immediately. He had already endured the scrutiny, the quiet questioning, the silent judgment of the system that could not easily reconcile instinct with rule. Yet the palace, patient and unyielding, would trace every cause, every effect, until the breach was either explained away or punished. And still, the child's safety, unquestionable, yet invisible in official eyes, was the only justification that mattered to him. Eventually, he was escorted back to the east corridor, now empty, bathed in afternoon light. The same dust motes floated lazily, the polished floors glimmered on the sun, and the walls carried their usual weight of history. But he did not look at them. He did not look at the portraits, the tapestries, the silent witnesses of protocol. His focus remained inward, on the line he had crossed, and the knowledge that it could never be uncrossed. There would be no ceremony to recognize what he had done. There would be no applause. Perhaps, in the eyes of history, he would be listed as a disruptor, a man who broke the rhythm of a flawless system. Yet, in those fleeting moments, as he stood alone and reflected, he understood the moral clarity of his choice. The rules of the palace were written in ink, centuries old. But some decisions, those that protect life, innocence, and duty itself, are etched in something far older. The palace held its breath. Officials prepared their formal statements. Cameras of internal security systems recorded every second. The guard, however, felt only the echo of one truth. A child's safety outweighed protocol. And in that weightless, almost imperceptible moment, a quiet shift occurred. The foundations of ceremonial perfection had trembled, not in scandal, not in catastrophe, but in human judgment. The corridor remained empty now, silent but not lifeless. The echoes of footsteps, of commands, of hesitation, lingered in the walls. And somewhere, hidden in plain sight, a detail unnoticed by all but one set of eyes suggested the breach had not been reckless. It had been necessary. The first wave of investigation concluded, yet the questions lingered. What had caused the guard to act? What had Charlotte sensed that others could not? And what system flaw had made his choice inevitable? The palace returned to its rhythm. But nothing was as it had been. Corridors once predictable now carried the faint echo of hesitation, the memory of a halt that should never have happened. Footfalls, once automatic, were measured more carefully. Eyes flicked to corners and doorways with renewed wariness. A subtle tension threading through every step. In the upper chambers, senior officials convened. Their voices were low, clipped, precise. Words chosen to reassure, to analyze, to contain. Every sentence was weighed against centuries of precedent. Protocol was the spine of the crown. It maintained the illusion of order, even when chaos nudged at the edges. Review the formation logs. An advisor ordered. Cross-reference every second from the east corridor. The camera drifts past the panel, focusing on sheets of meticulously logged movements. Guards' positions, time-stamps of door openings, notes on ceremonial pauses. Every action documented, every reaction cataloged. The halt, so brief, so deliberate, is recorded in stark black and white. Unauthorized stop, child escorted, no intruder found. But the logs, precise as they were, could not capture intent. They could not measure instinct. They could not account for the subtle breach of expectation that had rippled through the palace in less than 10 seconds. Across the palace, officers began to trace every rule, every regulation governing the movement of the royal children. Manuals lay open on polished tables, their pages yellowed but authoritative. The words, carefully chosen, formally binding, spoke of discipline, obedience, and hierarchy. Every guard trained under them, every protocol drilled into them from the first day, promised one thing above all else: control. Control, however, is fragile. In one dimly lit office, a senior instructor reviewed footage from the internal cameras. The guard's movements were precise, deliberate. His hand had stopped the procession, not in aggression, but in calculation. Every step followed instinct shaped by experience, not by protocol. Disobedience is easy to detect. The instructor muttered to himself, eyes narrowing. Judgment, true judgment, is far harder. Meanwhile, another officer cross-referenced the logs with the maintenance schedules. That minor oversight, the unlocked service door, stood out immediately. Officially, it was nothing. Routine checks. Nothing requiring alarm. Yet in combination with a child's hesitation and a trained guard's instinct, it became a chain reaction, a collision between rule and reality. The investigation unfolded like a delicate surgical procedure. Each document was a layer, each testimony, a thread. Whispered briefings filled corridors. The officer moved too quickly. The halt was unnecessary. One voice murmured, another countered. And yet, what if he prevented harm? The words were softer, almost inaudible, but they carried weight. A palace accustomed to precision rarely accommodated nuance. The guard himself remained in a holding room, though not in isolation. Observers sat quietly, recording his statements, but avoiding direct confrontation. The air was sterile controlled, a theater of analysis rather than judgment. Yet he sensed every calculation, every glance. They wanted answers, but they feared the implications of truth. Archival records were consulted. Centuries of precedent, of halts, of infractions, of in-the-moment decisions were scrutinized. The palace had survived wars, rebellions, even revolutions. Protocol had endured, but the records revealed something unusual. Very few incidents had challenged the assumption that a guard would never act independently. Those rare deviations had been buried quietly, documented minimally, and largely forgotten. The moral weight of centuries pressed down on him. The palace's system did not account for instinct. It did not account for the moment a human must act before the law or the schedule permits. And yet, instinct is rarely wrong when it comes to protecting the young, the vulnerable, the unprepared. Meanwhile, Princess Charlotte remained carefully shielded from the investigation. Her caretakers reported her as unaware of the disruption, a narrative that suited the palace's need for calm. But the child's eyes, observant, precise, had seen the disruption. She remembered the hand that protected her, the authority that bent for a moment in favor of life over rule. Back in the archive room, another detail emerged. The internal communications logs revealed a discrepancy. Messages recorded after the halt did not align with the official timeline. Footnotes were missing. Names of officers who had witnessed the event were unlisted. Somewhere, subtly, the narrative had been controlled, but imperfectly. Small inconsistencies hinted at a human failure preceding the guard's action. A slow realization took root among the investigators. The incident might not be a simple breach. It could be a symptom, a signal that the palace, for all its precision and centuries of codified hierarchy, had gaps invisible to the written law, and that understanding made the hall almost inevitable. The system failed before he acted, an analyst whispered, almost to herself. He didn't create the risk. He responded to it. Outside, the palace corridors hummed with the mundane. Doors opened and closed. Guards resumed their rounds. The public saw nothing amiss. Inside, the Foundation control had been tested. Subtly, quietly, the palace had been reminded that protocol is only as strong as the humans who uphold it. Later, the guard was summoned to a secondary briefing. Senior officials dissected every micro-movement, every command, every glance. Questions were precise. Did you foresee any consequences? Could the halt have endangered the princess further? Was there any ambiguity in your observation? He answered with restraint, clarity, and, when necessary, silence. His testimony was both factual and moral, a ledger of action and instinct. Every word measured, every pause deliberate. As hours turned to days, the narrative crystallized. He had acted. The child had been unharmed. The system had been challenged. And yet, the palace could not declare victory, nor could it fully admit fault. Officially, the incident was a breach. Unofficially, it was a quiet revelation. Control is never absolute. Even in the oldest institutions, the human element remains unpredictable, ungovernable, and essential. Archives, communications, and reports converged. The halt was documented with language that minimized deviation but preserved fact. Notes were added. Small inconsistencies noted. Further review recommended. An incident file was quietly flagged for reopening. An acknowledgement that even the palace's meticulous logs might conceal more than they revealed. In the background, life continued. Princess Charlotte's schedule remained uninterrupted. Ceremonial routes were adjusted only slightly. The palace appeared unshaken, but the air of scrutiny had deepened, imperceptible to all but those who understood what had almost happened. The guard, meanwhile, reflected on the paradox of duty. Protocol demanded obedience, yet true protection sometimes required defiance. He had lived it, executed it, and now awaited judgment from a system that prized order over instinct. A subtle question lingered among the senior officials, unspoken but palpable. If a guard's instinct can override centuries of law, what else in the palace might defy expectation? The palace, from the outside, remained immaculate. Its stone walls gleamed under winter sunlight. Visitors saw only ceremony, the flawless rotation of guards, the polished floors reflecting centuries of tradition. Inside, however, there was a quiet storm. In a dimly lit chamber, the guard was again confronted by senior officials. Their faces neutral, but their scrutiny sharp. They circled him with questions that seemed formal but carried subtle accusation. Each word, each pause was meant to probe. Was his decision a lapse of judgment or something more insidious? "Why did you stop the procession?" one officer asked, voice steady but rigid. "Did you perceive a threat?" "I did," the guard replied. "It was not immediate in the conventional sense, but I observed conditions that could have led to harm. I acted to prevent it." Another officer leaned forward. "A child's safety is paramount," he said, "but you acted outside protocol. You disrupted the palace's order. You could have endangered others." The guard's gaze held firm. "My responsibility was the princess, not the procedure, not the ceremony. Her safety outweighed all else." The room went silent, not because they doubted his words, but because in the silence, the moral weight became undeniable. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the palace, Princess Charlotte sat quietly in her private quarters, fidgeting with the corner of a folded handkerchief. The child had been shielded from the official inquiries, her schedule maintained as if nothing had happened. But children understand disruption differently than adults. They feel what cannot be spoken. She remembered a corridor, the slight hesitation in the air, the sudden presence of protection. She remembered instinct enacted, authority bending for a fleeting moment to something deeper, more human. Her caretaker, observing her closely, noted the child's unusual silence. "Did something upset you?" she asked gently. Charlotte shook her head. "I'm not sure," she whispered. "It's like someone stopped the world for a moment, and I knew why, even though no one said a word." Back in the interrogation chamber, the guard's mind replayed every instant. The open corridor, the uncertainty in the child's posture, the absence of threat, but the presence of danger in subtle forms only experience could detect. Every second he had hesitated would have been fatal. If the child had moved forward, the officials pressed further. "You acted independently," one said, "against explicit instructions, against every rule you swore to uphold. What if your perception was wrong?" He considered the question carefully. If my perception was wrong, the consequences would have been immediate and visible. I judged with all available evidence, and I acted in a single moment that prioritized life over rule. That is my decision and my responsibility. The tension in the room thickened. Senior officers exchanged glances, some approving, some silently critical. They understood instinct, yet feared it. They understood the moral clarity of his actions, yet could not fully endorse deviation from centuries of codified behavior. Hours stretched into the evening. Reports were written and rewritten. Witness statements were cross-checked. Footage from the internal cameras was analyzed frame by frame. Every micro-expression, every fleeting glance, every fraction of a second where a decision hung in balance was scrutinized. Then, in a quieter chamber, away from the official scrutiny, a subtle revelation began to emerge. A junior officer, reviewing archival notes, noticed the faintest discrepancy. A notation of an unusual sound, almost imperceptible, a creak of the floorboards that coincided precisely with the princess's hesitation. A gap in the service log suggested that the corridor had been momentarily unsecured. The implication was profound. The palace's strict protocols, the so-called infallible system, had not prevented the moment of vulnerability, the very gap that the guard had acted to cover. And suddenly, the incident was no longer a simple matter of insubordination. It was a failure of the system itself. The guard, standing alone in the observation room, understood the implication immediately. The child's safety had depended not on hierarchy, procedure, or ceremony, but on a human response to imperfection. His actions, previously condemned as reckless, now appeared almost inevitable. Meanwhile, Princess Charlotte's understanding of the event deepened. Alone in her room, she traced her small fingers over furniture, replaying the moments in her mind. She remembered the sound of the guard's command, the firmness of his arm, the instinctive priority given to her over procession itself. A subtle tear formed, not from fear, but from a recognition that someone had seen her, not as a protocol to protect, but as a child to safeguard. Back in the official chambers, the debate continued. Some senior officials pushed for formal reprimand, citing rules and order. Others argued for leniency, recognizing that the child's welfare had been preserved precisely because of the guard's decisive judgment. The room became a moral battleground, weighing centuries of precedent against a single moment of human instinct. A breakthrough came when a previously overlooked log was reopened, a notation detailing a maintenance check that had left the corridor vulnerable for exactly 3 minutes. The guard had acted within that narrow window, a window that the system itself had failed to secure. The revelation reframed everything. The halt, once considered insubordination, was now a calculated, necessary act of protection. The palace, for all its grandeur and discipline, had been insufficient in a moment when the human element mattered most. The senior officials leaned back, their expressions a mix of relief and unease. The incident was no longer solely a matter of protocol violation. It was a test of the institution's ability to account for human unpredictability, and the results were uncomfortable. In a smaller room, the guard was finally alone. He reflected on the corridor, on the child, on the weight of responsibility. Every second had been a choice. Every hesitation, a potential catastrophe. And yet, in the clarity of solitude, he understood a profound truth. Loyalty is measured not by adherence to rules, but by the courage to act when rules fail. Princess Charlotte, unaware of the procedural debate surrounding her, returned quietly to her daily routine. Yet her awareness of the guard's actions lingered. In her mind, The incident had a clarity that adults could not replicate. Someone had chosen her safety above everything else, without hesitation, without consideration for consequence. That night, as the palace lights dimmed and corridors emptied, the moral tension of the day remained unresolved. The guard's actions had saved the child, but in doing so, he had fractured the seamless appearance of control that the palace relied upon. The institution would endure, the rules would persist, but a subtle vulnerability had been exposed, one that few were willing to acknowledge. And the guard, standing alone, knew that the day's choice had shifted something irreversibly. The child's unspoken understanding, the system's imperfection, the weight of centuries of protocol, all converge into a single, quiet truth. Sometimes, the line between duty and instinct is measured not in rules, but in the courage to act when silence would have been easier. The palace exhaled a long, measured breath, though to anyone outside, nothing had changed. Ceremonial footsteps echoed as before. Guards rotated along familiar routes. Chandeliers reflected the winter sun in patterns that were unchanged, precise. Yet within the walls, a subtle tension lingered. Every corridor, every staircase, every echoing hall carried the invisible residue of a choice made that could not be undone. The decision to intervene, executed in mere seconds, had left its imprint, not in documents, not in reports, but in the conscience of the institution. The guard had been quietly removed from active duty. Not dishonorably. His record remained intact, but his presence in routine operations was curtailed. A reassignment, formal yet understated, shielded him from the public eye. To the palace, it was a solution that preserved appearances. To him, it felt like exile, though no one spoke of blame outright. Meanwhile, hidden correspondence began to surface. Memos between senior officials, marked confidential, documented the subtle orchestration of perception. Logs were amended, statements carefully rewritten. Even medical reports, which contained minor details about the princess's reaction to the disruption, were restricted. Each file moved to a sealed archive, accessible only to a handful of individuals. The palace had mastered the art control, but even mastery requires vigilance. For every whisper that could leak, there was a countermeasure. For every record that hinted at imperfection, there was a redaction. The system was vast, precise, and relentless, but it could not entirely erase the memory of what had transpired. Princess Charlotte, shielded from the administrative machinations, carried her own quiet burden. She could not articulate fully what had happened in the East Corridor. Adults had framed the day as routine, yet she remembered every nuance. The moment the guard's hand stopped her forward, the tone of his voice, the instinctive command that bent the rules for her safety. It was a memory encoded in emotion rather than words, a memory that no protocol could undo. The guard, now separated from the child's daily presence, moved to his new assignment with methodical precision. Yet his mind remained tethered to that corridor. He replayed the halt endlessly, analyzing every microsecond. Every choice he had made was justified in instinct, but the palace could not see instinct. They only saw a deviation. And so he bore the quiet weight of consequences, unspoken, unacknowledged. Within the palace bureaucracy, debates continued, but behind closed doors, officers discussed the incident with meticulous detachment, cataloging every potential weakness the halt revealed. How could a single human act disrupt decades of choreographed order? What had been overlooked in training, maintenance, oversight? Questions were asked not to assign blame publicly, but to anticipate future vulnerabilities. A suppressed medical report revealed what no one else could see. The child had experienced a moment of acute stress, minor yet measurable, in the corridor. This data, seemingly trivial, was enough to validate the guard's intervention, yet it was never cited publicly. Its contents were carefully archived, accessible only to those whose duty was to protect not the child's memory, but the palace's perception of flawless control. Letters between aides noted the emotional undercurrents the incident had left behind. The princess's quiet reflection, her subtle signs of hesitation, the faint traces of recognition for the guard's courage, all catalogued, discussed, but never disclosed. It was the palace's unspoken calculus. Maintain order at the surface, control perception, and allow the emotional truth to exist only in the private memory of those involved. The guard, isolated from the ceremonial sphere, began to comprehend the full weight of silence. His action had saved the child, yet it had also exposed imperfection, and the palace, committed to the illusion of control, would never publicly acknowledge the truth. His duty had been fulfilled, but the acknowledgement, the recognition, the moral affirmation would remain forever hidden. Even the senior officials wrestled quietly with their own awareness. A hallway conversation, conducted with hushed tones, revealed their internal tension. "We cannot let the story escape," one officer said. "The public cannot know that instinct occasionally supersedes protocol." Another replied, "And yet, if we do not document it correctly, the lesson will be lost internally. It is a delicate balance." In these quiet moments, the palace became almost suffocating in its silence. Every gesture, every order, every adjustment was calibrated to maintain not just security, but perception. The guard's action, heroic yet disruptive, could not be celebrated openly. To do so would undermine centuries of assumed perfection. To ignore it entirely would be a betrayal of the child he had protected. The corridor itself, once the scene of sudden action, remained unchanged. Its marble floors gleamed under sunlight. Dust motes drifted lazily in the beams. But memory lingered, intangible yet potent. The silence was thick, heavy with the knowledge of a moral act that the palace could neither deny nor acknowledge. Princess Charlotte returned to her routines with the surface ease expected of royalty. Lessons were attended, ceremonial obligations fulfilled. Yet, in quiet moments, she would glance toward corridors she had traversed, recalling the invisible presence that had shielded her. The adults around her saw compliance. She carried understanding. The silent recognition protection, instinct over procedure, was hers alone. The guard, now distanced from the public sphere of royal duty, reflected on the paradox of his position. He had acted rightly, morally, decisively, yet the system he served could not honor him without undermining itself. Duty had been preserved, safety ensured, protocol maintained, in appearance only, and the truth remained suspended between acknowledgement and suppression. A subtle, almost imperceptible tension threaded to the palace's internal communications. Files marked confidential were cross-checked, double-checked, and re-archived. The slightest hint that the event had been more than a procedural breach was removed. Every measure was taken to restore the palace's image of unbroken control, even as the reality of human judgment had quietly intruded. The guard walked alone through halls once familiar, now strange in their quiet weight. Portraits of past monarchs seemed to watch him with silent curiosity. Their painted eyes, frozen for centuries, might have been observing not his breach, but the moral courage that drove it. The palace's silence was deliberate. It was not empty. It was full of calculation, of containment, of subtle acknowledgement that some truths cannot be spoken aloud. And in that silence, the guard and the princess shared a private understanding that no official statement could capture, that instinct, courage, and loyalty often reside beyond the reach of formal rules. The palace resumed its rhythm, though it carried a new subtlety, an undercurrent only perceptible to those who had witnessed the events unfold. Footfalls remained precise. Ceremonial rotations continued as expected, yet a quiet change lingered, imperceptible to the public, visible only to those attuned to nuance. Duty had been exercised in a way that transcended protocol. The guard returned to his new assignment quietly. There was no fanfare, no recognition. His movements were methodical, precise, unchanged externally, but internally, he carried the weight of a choice that had altered the perception of what it meant to serve. Every step, every gesture, was measured by instinct tempered with experience. Senior officials watched him carefully, yet without the hostility of previous days. Their silence was not approval, but acknowledgement. They understood in private that he had acted correctly, morally, decisively, but celebrated only in the realm of the unspoken. A quiet respect lingered in their measured observations. Within the palace archives, the incident file remained sealed, yet subtly annotated. Notes detailed the events, not as scandal, but as precedent. The palace, meticulous as always, preserved a record for internal reference only, a tacit acknowledgement that rules are essential, yet occasionally, human judgment must override them. Princess Charlotte's daily routines continued without disruption. To observers, she was the same poised, graceful child attending lessons and ceremonial duties. Yet her awareness of the corridor incident remained private and profound. The quiet understanding that someone had placed her safety above all else, above protocol, above procedure, was hers alone. On rare occasions, she glanced toward the hallway she had once traversed, a fleeting recognition protection, of courage enacted in silence. The adults around her saw nothing unusual. They were not meant to. Understanding, in its purest form, is often invisible to those who rely solely on observation. The guard superiors convened quietly, determining the appropriate course of resolution. Punishment was unnecessary. Recognition would be limited to private commendation. Publicly, protocol remained unbroken. The palace's appearance of perfection could not be compromised. Yet within the walls, a subtle recalibration occurred. Policies were reviewed, minor adjustments implemented, and lessons noted for future training. In his reassignment, the guard engaged in duties that required diligence, discretion, and restraint. He carried the moral clarity of his actions like a quiet talisman. No one could reward him without compromising the institution, and no one could condemn him without contradicting the truth. In this delicate balance, he found a form of resolution, a comprehension that duty sometimes demands invisibility. The palace, in its orchestration, had preserved continuity. Ceremonial schedules were untouched. Public appearances proceeded flawlessly. Yet beneath the surface, the ripple of the guard's choice endured. Senior officials referenced the incident in hushed tones, abstracted from narrative but precise in content. It became a lesson in vigilance, judgment, and moral courage, without ever being named publicly. In private moments, the guard reflected on the paradox of service. He had acted correctly. He had protected the vulnerable. He had upheld the ultimate responsibility of his role. Yet acknowledgement, praise, or visible gratitude were absent. His reward was silent, measured, and internal. And for those who understood the nature of duty, this was sufficient. Princess Charlotte, observing the world with childlike acuity, recognized the continuity of care and protection. She understood, without articulation, the complexity of the guard's decisions, the subtle bending of rules to preserve life. In her private reflection, she held a quiet respect, a recognition that transcended ceremony, instruction, or reward. Across the palace, minor adjustments were quietly implemented. Routes were revised, maintenance schedules corrected, and communication protocols reinforced. The system remained robust, yet subtly enhanced by the lessons drawn from imperfection. Human judgment, once an anomaly, was now accounted for in the architecture of protection. The guard continued his work with dignity. Each action was informed by experience, guided by moral clarity, and executed without expectation of recognition. In this, he found an equilibrium, the convergence of duty, courage, and discretion. Even as life within the palace proceeded with flawless precision, the memory of the corridor incident endured, a quiet testament to the unseen decisions that preserved safety, innocence, and integrity. It was a story that would never be told publicly, yet its influence would shape the culture of vigilance for years to come. And in a final, understated moment, Princess Charlotte and the guard shared a fleeting exchange, a glance, a subtle acknowledgement, unspoken yet profound. It conveyed understanding, respect, and recognition. The child's awareness of courage and protection, though invisible to others, remained intact. The palace had resumed its unbroken rhythm. Ceremonial routines continued with immaculate precision. Guards rotated along corridors. Chandeliers reflected light on polished floors, and visitors observed only order, not the human judgments that quietly ensured it. Yet the echo of decisions long past, decisions made in the space between protocol and instinct, remained. They were imperceptible to most, but to those who served, to those who watched, and to those who had been protected, they lingered like a faint undertone beneath the melody of ceremony. The guard, now far removed from the corridors where the incident had occurred, reflected on his service. His choices, though unseen, had preserved life and innocence. Recognition was neither sought nor given. The acknowledgement he carried was private, embedded in the quiet knowledge of moral responsibility fulfilled. He understood with clarity that standing still is sometimes more dangerous than action. In the palace, the machinery of control, rules, hierarchy, protocol, can give the illusion of safety. But without the courage to act when those systems fail, the consequences are profound. The cost of inaction, though invisible, can be far greater than the consequences of breach. For centuries, the crown had relied upon guardians unseen, acting in moments that required discretion, moral clarity, and courage. These guardians preserved the monarchy not for glory, but for the continuity of life, for the preservation of innocence, for protection of the unprepared. Their deeds were unrecorded publicly, their impact subtle, yet no less profound. Princess Charlotte, too, carried a memory quietly. The child's awareness of protection, of instinct enacted to shield her, was a private understanding of duty and courage. Though she would grow in years and experience, she would never forget that moment when protocol bent in favor of humanity, and when someone chose moral clarity over rigid obedience. The palace archives, meticulously maintained, contain countless instances of such invisible courage. Files sealed from public view documented the quiet interventions, the judgments exercised in shadows, the decisions that balanced duty with morality. These acts, though hidden, formed the unspoken backbone of royal continuity. In reflecting upon his actions, the guard recognized a universal truth. The weight of duty often falls upon those unseen, unacknowledged, yet unwavering. To stand still when intervention is required can be a betrayal. To act, even when rules are strict, can be the truest fulfillment of service. The palace itself, magnificent and imposing, remained an enduring symbol of structure, hierarchy, and ceremony. Yet beneath the surface, the silent lessons of courage persisted. Every officer trained, every guard deployed, carried within him the understanding that instinct and judgment are as vital as codified orders. Even in his reassignment, the guard observed, reflected, and internalized these truths. The palace's perfection to the public was absolute. Behind closed doors, it was contingent upon the unseen, the courageous, the morally resolute. These guardians acted without expectation of acknowledgement. Their reward the quiet knowledge that duty had been fulfilled. Across the centuries, history is often written in terms of ceremony, legislation, and spectacle. But the true preservation of life, innocence, and continuity is often invisible, occurring in moments that leave no public trace. The guard stand, his single decisive act, joined an unbroken chain of such moments, acts of courage that quietly maintain the foundations of monarchy. As the sun set over the palace, casting long shadows across the gardens, corridors, and ceremonial halls, the silence was not empty. It was full of memory, reflection, and quiet understanding. Every stone, every painting, every carefully polished surface bore witness, not to spectacle, but to unseen courage. The guard, walking through the corridors he had once patrolled, felt the weight of time, of responsibility, and of moral clarity. He understood the true cost of standing still, the potential for harm, the burden of inaction, the erosion of duty. And he understood equally the cost of acting, judgment, scrutiny, and the loneliness of decisions made in moral clarity. Princess Charlotte, growing into her awareness, would carry a nuanced understanding of service, protection, and courage. She would know, though not in words, the value of those who act without expectation, who choose instinct and moral responsibility over procedure. The palace would endure as it always had. Its routines, ceremonies, and public appearances would remain flawless. Yet within its walls, the lessons of courage, moral judgment, and silent protection would persist, quietly shaping the culture of vigilance for generations to come.